Welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast and YouTube show for SQL Server database administrators and developers. I'm Kendra Little from Redgate Software and from SQLWorkbooks.com. Now today we've got a question about how developers and DBAs collaborate in a DevOps world. And this question comes from a reader. I have paraphrased and anonymized the question. And here's a little bit of the backstory. We've got an existing dev team and a team of database administrators, and they've got some history. I mean, we all do, right? In this environment, Entity Framework was once used to generate the database schema because they were working to very quickly iterate and generate products. But things didn't work out so great. Not a lot of thought was put into the database design, and not out of laziness, just not a lot of knowledge. And essentially what was happening was the development team didn't have a lot of expertise in database architecture, and they weren't reaching out to the database team. And there was a little bit of an architectural mess, performance problems, maintenance issues, all kinds of things. But that's in the past. Those things actually got cleared up, and the team found a new way of working together. And that went on for a little while, but once again, things are changing, and there is a DevOps initiative that's moving on through. As part of the DevOps initiative, the development team wants to move to fully automated deployments. Now, there's a lot of benefits to fully automated deployments. If we are making sure that we aren't making manual changes, and we're pushing all of our deployments through an automated way, we can have very, very repeatable deployments. We can know that the exact way a change is being made in environment A is the same way the change is being made in environment B, removes the risk of manual error, and that's really great. If we also push all our changes through automated deployments, we lower our risk that some of our environments are going to drift away from other environments, and environment drift makes it harder to believe that the thing you validated in one environment is actually going to work in another environment. So there's a lot of great things about automation, but as part of this, the development team would like for the orchestration tool that manages all of this automation to have sysadmin rights in all environments, not just in dev environments, but also the ability to create tables in production and pre-production. Maybe even the ability to create databases in production and in pre-production. And this desire to move more into a DevOps way of working is creating some concern for the DBA team. So the question was this: what should we do when confronted with this risk? What we think we may want to do is actually really just control this deployment account. So this high permission deployment account, maybe what we should do is generally leave it disabled. And when there's a need to do a deployment, the development team asks the DBA team, hey, could you enable that account? The DBA team enables the account in the critical environments, pre-production and production, and allows the change to roll through. So this was the question of, do you think this will work or not? And the first thing I did was just clarify, okay, now what is the reason why you would want to manually enable this account, right? What is the value that you would get out of this? And I asked this as a genuine question because I might imagine that I know what the answer is, but maybe the thing I would imagine was not right. So I asked, what is it that you're worried about such that you would want to control this account, and what would you get out of disabling and enabling it? And the idea is that the concerns that the team of database administrators have is that they won't know what's going on. If all of this is automated and things are just flowing through, that things will happen and the database team won't even know, hey, have changes been rolling out? Have changes not been rolling out? That they will not have insight into what changes are moving through the pipeline and what's happening. And that furthermore, they'll move back to a world where expertise in database changes isn't thought about, where changes flow through in a kind of fast way and the teams are no longer working together, right? So the idea of manually controlling these permissions is in part to create a point where changes can be reviewed, as well as just having the understanding of what changes are moving through the pipeline. Now, I get why this would seem like a possible solution. I do think that it needs to be shifted a little bit, right? We absolutely do need collaboration between the two teams, but in a DevOps world, having the interaction being at this point very, very close to the deployment of the production, that this is going to create some friction between the teams. And I absolutely think there are better ways that you can do this that will have the teams working in more of a, collaborative way, working in a way where people aren't kind of working against each other, where work isn't having to be undone, right? Our goal is to collaborate in a way that means that we aren't having to go back and redo a bunch of stuff periodically, but we still have the ability for the subject matter experts on the database to know what changes are flowing through and to be able to offer expertise and review of changes, but at the right time in the process that's really going to work in a DevOps world. So what we're going to talk about is a few things. We're going to go bigger picture than this, right? Because the answer to this isn't just in shift the review left, right? We're going to talk about what shifting the review left means, what that looks like. Yes, that's part of it, but it's bigger than this. We need to think about, okay, in a world where we're doing DevOps, what are the different possible relationships between a subject matter expert team, such as a database team and the developers? Like, what are the different models that may work for this? What are the models that don't work for this and why? And then also a second thing we're going to think about is the role of subject matter experts in a DevOps world. The DBA team in a DevOps world really shifts. If you're making that team be effective, you shift from the role of gatekeeper. You shift away from that. You're no longer the gatekeepers, and you become more of a team of internal consultants. And I actually think this is a really good thing. I think it turns you away from a group of kind of being order takers who kind of manually deploy things into a role of advisors and people with insights, with people who can recommend successful strategies that work in the real world, which I just think is a more fun job to have. And then third, we're going to talk about creating a community of practice around database work and what that means in a DevOps environment. So we've really got three big things that we're going to talk about in terms of how do DBAs and developers collaborate together. So you might be kind of like, well, come on, is it really worth it? Like, that sounds like a lot of work. Well, it is worth it. More and more, DevOps is important. And you don't have to get hung up on the word DevOps. What's the definition of DevOps, right? My favorite definition of DevOps comes from Microsoft's Donovan Brown. And Donovan Brown defines DevOps as the union of people, process, and tools to enable the continuous delivery of value to end users. Now, there's a lot about this statement that's really important, but the thing about this is it's all about being able to continuously and regularly deliver value to customers. And the reason that this really matters, the reason that you should pay attention, is that organizations all around the world, it's not just that they are waking up, they all have woken up to the fact that they all need to be able to deliver value to customers regularly and more frequently. You and me, customers everywhere, we expect products and features to improve constantly all the time, right? If I subscribe to a service, yes, I expect high quality service that I bought for, but I also more and more expect to be surprised by, hey, look, there's this cool new feature I can use, right? And if that doesn't happen, what do? I start looking at their competitors, right? This happens everywhere. This is happening from companies that make coffee pods to companies that sell tractors to companies that make washing machines to companies that make all sorts of different software around the internet. And what DevOps does is it really aligns with and is kind of the science of how do we deliver value more quickly. And so if we're part of a subject matter expert team like DBAs, and we are creating friction with this process, if we are slowing down the delivery of value, well, that's kind of a problem in the organization. So it really is worth saying, how do we adapt to this world? And how do we also focus on delivering value regularly while keeping data safe, right? Because that is really, an important thing to do. It's not that it's not important to keep the data safe anymore. It's that we need to figure out how do we do this responsibly in a DevOps world, and how do we collaborate with developers in this different paradigm? And there's absolutely different ways to do this. So the first thing is thinking about how do our teams actually work together, right? Because you don't just have to say, hey, we're all going to be one big team. And in fact, in many organizations, that's just not going to work because it's more complicated than that. My favorite resource for this is a site that is all about what's called DevOps topologies. So if you go over to devopstopologies.com or web.devopstopologies.com, what you'll find is a lot of really cool diagrams and commentary, and they show topologies, or relationships between teams. They show them as both anti-patterns and explain why these patterns don't work so well with DevOps, as well as patterns that do work and explain why those patterns work better with DevOps. And this can be really, really useful when you're thinking through, okay, how do we actually all work together? Two folks are responsible for putting this together. Matthew Skelton, and I'm totally going to massacre the name, but I'll give it my best shot. Manuel Pais are responsible for the site. Great, great work. They've got a book coming out soon. I'm really looking forward to it. They've got all this information on the site for free now. And where we're starting from with this team is where a lot of us start from. It's under anti-type G on the site. It's dev and DBA silos. And this topology, which is an anti-pattern, this is a pattern that doesn't work very well with DevOps. This is where we're starting from. We've got the developers all in one group. And then we've got an operations group that's separate from that, and the DBAs sit within the operations group, right? There is no overlap between the DBAs and the developers. Things are kind of thrown over from one group to the other, right? But we're really, really separate. Now, why doesn't this work? One of the problems with this model that Matthew and Manuel explain with the site, right? I'm quoting them from their site here, DevOps Topologies, is they say when we're separated like this, what tends to happen is that the DBAs become gatekeepers. The role of the DBA is that they, very late in the development process, are looking at the changes and they're like, yeah, should this go to production or not? Right? So we're kind of gatekeeping on production. We aren't really involved in development. We're just sort of protecting production. Well, that's a problem because DevOps really focuses not on occasionally doing a deployment, right? We are looking at frequently delivering value to our customers, and small deployments, frequent small deployments are key to this. This is for a couple of reasons. One, if we're making small changes, we're limiting our risk on each deployment we make. And that's kind of cool. I actually really like that from a database perspective, right? If we have just made a couple little changes in a deployment and something looks different, hey, I've got a pretty narrow scope to look at. So as long as I've got insight into what those changes are, as long as I have insight into that pipeline that's running through, small deployments are no problem. But if our teams are really, really separate and we aren't working together, reviewing those little small deployments becomes friction, right? We don't want to just be, kind of gatekeeping on production as a way of having insight into those small changes. But small deployments they're useful for other reasons too. As we are, kind of developing features and getting them out, if we have this practice of doing it kind of in small batches and then lighting up the changes fairly regularly for our customers, we may find that as we are kind of, building new things towards a new feature, we have a goal in mind. We have an end, combination of all of this functionality in mind. But what we may find along the way is we may find that our customers are using things a little differently than they thought we would. We may have emerging knowledge about, hey, this other thing related to what we're doing is actually cooler than what we're starting out to do. Let's change course, right? So that's another reason that we want to have these small deployments. We want to be able to react to emerging information about things as we light them up and as they become released. So it's not, just for funsies that we want to do small deployments. It's very useful to have frequent small deployments, and having the groups really separated and doing this gatekeeping thing doesn't really work well with frequent small deployments. Another thing is just that if we are gatekeeping and we're identifying problems right before they're ready for production, we're causing a lot of rework, right? If a change is moving through the pipeline, I want to identify potential problems with that change as early as possible in the development cycle, because I don't want to waste time on automated testing and a QA environment and user acceptance testing and then only after that identify the problem and then have to go through all of that again. No, it's much, much more efficient for everyone involved, for the whole organization, if we can have a way to get feedback between these two groups from the subject matter experts on the change early in the software development cycle, way before we're proposing to deploy this in production, right? If we're thinking about how do I best design this change, I want to think about that when I'm designing the change. That just makes sense, right? So the classic structure of these teams only interacting in a separate way, it has a problem with that. Instead, something that works better, this is described in Type 9 on the DevOps Topologies site. And for folks who are listening and not watching, what Topology 9 is it introduces a specialization within the development organization of a database development specialist, right? So it's a development DBA or a developer who's particularly either interested in or talented at or, just willing to be kind of a database specialist. And what happens is if you identify these folks in the development org and you pair up with them and you work with them closely, the thing you ask of them is, we want to find a way that we can do DevOps together, that the DBAs, that the subject matter experts can be part of the DevOps lifecycle so that earlier on, we can be called in to help review changes early. We can shift that review left so that we're identifying these problems before you waste a bunch of time. And that also, when there's different times where you want to do some whiteboarding about architecture, right? When you are like, we're going to make some, kind of big changes over the next few sprints. Let's kind of step back and think a little bit about what the best way to do things are. When those types of discussions are happening, you want these specialists to be around because those are going to be the folks who are like, hey, it would be great. We need to loop in somebody from this other team. They'll help us out with this. They'll have great ideas, right? They'll help advocate for your team, help bring you in, and help kind of reformulate that relationship because for years you've been the gatekeepers. And having this group of development database specialists working with kind of people in the database team who you're kind of saying, hey, we, the DBAs, really want to partner with you. You create this kind of little coalition that helps with database DevOps function. Now, I really believe in this topology because the first time I looked at this diagram, I immediately thought back to a real world experience I'd had where we kind of naturally found these folks in the development teams and they partnered with us and they really, really helped make this work better. And were really key to doing this. So I saw this model and I was like, yes, I recognize this. This is something that I've actually seen be successful without ever, before I ever saw the diagram. I really, really believe that this can work. So these days with modern source control systems, what does this actually look like? Well, this tends to be shifting that review away from, we don't want the review to happen when we're ready to deploy the change to staging. We want it to happen more like at a time when people are creating either, something like a pull request, or depending on what version control system you're using, it might be something like a merge request, something like that. But effectively, the way things happen in development, very, very common pattern these days, kind of basic, is if I'm, working on a feature, I create a branch in source control. So I have a private space to work on it. And, I work on my feature in that branch. And when I'm ready to push it into the pipeline, I'm going to create a request to merge it into another branch. And my change is going to get reviewed at this point. This is the point where if we're changing things in the database, this is the point where you do want a subject matter expert to be like, hey, I am also going to be a reviewer of this change. I'm going to take a look at this. Are we using the right data types? If we thought about indexing, how does this work? And automation can help with this. Like there's all sorts of automation in these orchestration tools now. So you can do things like when the pull request is initiated, and I'm using the Git terminology here, just most people use Git, so it's easy to use the Git terminology. When the pull request is created, our orchestration tool may look around and be like, oh, I see you have a pull request. I'm going to kick off a build of your SQL code, make sure it builds. I am going to identify or create, depending on what you're doing, an environment to deploy this code to, and I'm going to deploy it to. So when the person or people reviewing the change request come around, they actually have an environment that they can work with to review the code, right? Instead of just like reviewing lines of code on a screen, I might want to interact with it, especially if it's a database, and test it out and make sure things work properly. So you can actually do, this isn't just like that looks good. Joan, that looks great, or Bob, that looks fine. This is actually interacting with the code, being able to really do a deep review. That's the point in time where you want your subject matter experts to be called in to look at the change. And having those database specialists in the dev team can help you identify, okay, how much of this can we automate given our tools and our processes and what we look at right now? What are the best ways to make sure that, we are removing as much manual work as possible? We don't want to rely on email if we don't have to, but what are the ways that we can really make this work as possible? And also the second part of this, right? There's two parts of this. There was a code review, right? We want that to happen early. The other part of this is the awareness of changes that are moving through the pipeline. Now, this can also be automated in a ton of different ways with these orchestration tools. For instance, maybe when pull requests are approved, maybe you would like to see the messages with the commits displayed in your Slack channel, your team Slack channel, or in some other place. A lot of this can be automated just to give you awareness of what is running through the pipeline. Because the subject matter experts on your end, you should have the ability to see into this pipeline, right? You shouldn't have to ask somebody about, hey, what changes are being deployed. You should get to be familiar with this pipeline too. You should be able to kind of suggest, hey, here's things that would be useful for us to know. Having those specialists on the other side kind of helps you have a context. Hey, we'd like to know these things. How is a way that we could get notified of this that isn't a ton of work, right? They can help you work those things out. But that's really what you want to do, is you want this collaboration to be more and more about your team being part of and having insight into the whole software development pipeline, rather than being gatekeepers at the end of it. Because being gatekeepers at the end of it just isn't good for the organization. Kicking back changes wastes a ton of work. You want to identify things as early as possible, and you want to be able to make suggestions in this change pipeline too, right? You're specialists and you have deep access to the production environment. You probably have indexes you think should be changed. Is this something that maybe you should be able to do a pull request for too, right? Like, being part of this pipeline is absolutely a beneficial and helpful thing, and learning these tools and these skills really, really going to be useful for the future, because more and more, we don't want to be doing manual work to deploy software. So this is really thinking about what are the best ways our teams can work together. How can we shift this review left? Really, really critical to answering this. But that's not just it. The second thing I think to think about is, as the DBA team kind of gets more involved in the software development lifecycle, if you aren't gatekeepers, if you aren't just about controlling releases, what are all the different ways you can add value to the organization? And starting to work more as internal consultants rather than as kind of people who carry out tasks really can enhance the value of your team. And it also can help you work better with DevOps. There are tensions, the tensions of DevOps. It's not just that DBAs are seen as a blocker in DevOps. There are other folks who have tensions with DevOps too. So, for example, I recently have attended some conferences by Gartner. They have an enterprise architecture summit. And so I went to these summits and learned a lot about the problems that enterprise architects face in the modern world. And one of the big things is that when it comes to doing DevOps really, really popular, really helpful for organization. But the classical role of an architect who kind of designs everything ahead of time and says how things are going to be, yeah, that doesn't match so well with the DevOps environment, where we embrace small changes, where we really want to react to emerging requirements, and where we don't want to just do an architecture designed 18 months ago or 6 months ago even, right? We need to be able to change. We don't just want to follow orders. We need to be able to be creative. We need to be able to innovate. So what I took away from this conference was a lot of tools and ways of working that architects are developing. And I think a lot of these can be really useful to subject matter experts like DBAs when working in a DevOps environment. So one of the things architects are talking about these days is no longer creating guidelines, but instead establishing what they call guardrails. And guardrails are about communicating boundaries and explaining why these boundaries have value. They aren't prescribing, hey, you have to work in this exact way. They're more saying, we want to work within this area because outside of this area is dangerous and is bad for our organization, right? We want to be able to drive at a good speed down this road. We do not want to drive off the cliff, however, right? So there's a cliff. This is why it's a cliff. And here's how we avoid the cliff. It's also important when establishing guardrails to say, how do you know that it's working, right? How do we know that we're right about this? So I think it's easier to kind of look at an example of this. And my favorite example of guardrails uses a formula that was provided by Peter. I'm sorry, Peter. Your last name is tough for me as an American born in Texas. Peter Lindeck. He's on Twitter, he's at LINDEQP on Twitter. And Peter said, here's the basic formula for a guardrail. We believe that using X will result in Y, and we will know that it's working when Z. Right? So we're making a statement of belief. We're not saying thou shalt X and, not giving a reason, right? That's more of a guideline. A guideline is you should always blah. Well, there's usually exceptions to a lot of rules, right? Why should I always blah? Why is that important? Guardrail's different. We believe that using X will result in Y. We will know that it's working when Z. So an example of a guardrail that I might use as a database administrator is something like, we believe that masking data in all non-production environments will result in reduced risk of data breaches. And we'll know that this is working when we simulate a data breach after masking all this data, right? So I'm explaining that we shouldn't have copies of personally identifiable information in development because data breaches could really damage our organization, right? So what we want to do is we want these guardrails of, yes, we're going to have all these data sets in development. We may even be able to automate the creation of them, automate the masking of them. We may be able to have them available self-service, right? So for automation and things like merging that branch in, right? We want to be able to have access to this data to really validate our changes. We're saying, yeah, we believe we need to mask all the personally identifiable data in here. We give the reasons why, and we say how we're going to know that it's working. This is not just a kind of BS version of communication. I really think this has value because when you express things this way, it holds up over time, right? Just saying something like, you should always create a clustered index on a table. Well, why? And with what technology, right? Technology changes, and there's actually situations where we don't need that. So why would we believe that? And how would we know that it's true? Having these statements in there helps people over time look at it and understand, is this something that maybe no longer is value that we should raise with the group that established this guardrail, right? Or controversially, oh, I see why you would make this claim. I see why this has value. I understand the value in this, right? That's much more, provides a lot more information than a rule, and it's a lot friendlier to the people who are actually, working with the data as to understanding why we were doing things and what the potential impact on the organization would be if we didn't do them, for example. So I think it's really important to think about, instead of just setting down rules, explaining things in the format of these guardrails, which talks about values, which talks about measurement, which talks about, why these things are important. Another aspect of working as an internal consultant model, and these are insights from Saul Brand that I picked up, is he said, folks who are working, and he was talking about architects who are working as internal consultants, where focusing on your team is building up your ability to coach and mentor people in the area that you're a subject matter expert. How can you influence others so that they seek you out when they're thinking about what type of database should we use for this new project? Or how can we conquer this performance problem? You want them to think of you as a group that is very collaborative and that is a center of knowledge, right? So you're kind of building your brand as people who really care about data, as people who are knowledgeable about data, and as people who are good at explaining those things to other people and also good at learning, because you have to learn. These days, things change fast. We all have to learn all the time, right? We cannot rely on the things we learned 5 years ago because they're just not always true anymore. It's one of those tough things, right? So they want to be seen as a team that's always learning and that likes to help others and that likes to work with others. If you have been operating as gatekeepers in the past, if you have been operating as, we just tell you what to do and we really control your deployments, this is going to be a big shift, right? This is absolutely a shift that you can make over time. You may have to kind of work at it, because if you've got a brand of just being those folks who love to say no, changing into the team of those folks you want to talk to about how to really get something done right, that's going to be a tough situation, because what you really want in the modern organization is you want to be seen not just as the gatekeepers, but as the experts, right? As the people who really do know the best way to do things, is the people who do help you have the best ideas in the organization. Now, this may sound all nice and good, but you're like, in the meanwhile, Kendra, this just sounds like a way to get to deploy crappy code to production faster. Well, all right, we did talk about shifting code review left. If you are actually working on shifting code review left and getting involved in reviewing the code early in the development lifecycle, and crappy code is still getting shipped to production, well, what things in that code review process need to be improved, right? And there's absolutely, ways to improve that. What are the ways to have a more reliable environment to test in? What are the ways to have better automated testing to catch problems? Build that in, because, right, we are still involved in the code review process, and we want to be more and more involved in that software development lifecycle in that way. But there's another aspect of this too. There's another way to raise code quality when it comes to DevOps. And my favorite answer for this At one of Redgate's events, we do a SQL in the City event. We do it in different cities around the world. And in 2019 in London, there was a panel discussion. I was just in the audience, and someone asked the question from the audience, well, how do you improve database code quality in a DevOps world? And I wish I knew which panelist answered this, because I would love to give them the credit. I don't know who answered this, but their answer was, well, we have found that pager duty is very effective for raising code quality. In other words, putting developers on call with the ops people, yeah, turns out being waken up at 3 a.m. makes you think a lot more about your code quality than if you just roll into the office at 9 or 10 a.m. and find out that someone else fixed the issue overnight. Turns out getting waken up in the middle of the night does really help you care about code quality. But I'm not just joking about this. I think it's true. There's a lot of folks out there now who are saying that it's really important to have ownership over your code, that if you write code, you should also have ownership over supporting your code. Now, this doesn't mean that every developer gets sysadmin rights in production, or even that every developer gets persistent read rights in production. I've absolutely worked in organizations where we worked out ways that if there was an issue that occurred after a deployment, or which we believed to be related to a certain deployment, we had automated ways that the developers who had been involved in that change, that either them or a developer on call are granted dynamically access on demand, as needed, just the minimum access for that change to collaborate with the ops people to solve that problem, right? So this doesn't mean that you have to just open up security everywhere in order to do this, but it does mean that both the operations group, both the subject matter specialists, the DBAs, as well as the developers, that everyone is invested both in the tempo of releases and in the quality of releases. Because if you live in a world where the DBAs are in charge of stability and the developers are in charge of new features, and those are not shared responsibilities, you're going to have a real hard time doing DevOps, right? In a DevOps world, both groups are responsible both for tempo and for stability. And both groups are rewarded on doing well on both of those measures, right? We all should be working on the same pipeline, and we should all be thinking about quality as well as tempo in the context of that pipeline too, because high code quality means less rework. It means that the pipeline's working better, that we are more consistently delivering value to our customers, which is the whole goal of doing this. So that's the second part of this, is developing the database team as a team of internal consultants, instead of that old role of the team who likes to say no. The third piece of this is creating a community of practice. And a community of practice, this may or may not be a term that's familiar to you. The definition of it, it's defined by, this definition I'm using is from Etienne and Beverly Wenger-Trainer. And they have a post on this that they posted in 2011. And they say that what a community of practice is, it's a group of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do. And they learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. In other words, if you're a member of something like a user group, this is a lot like a user group at work. It's people who are interested or passionate about doing something, and we get together to talk about, here are the things we're working on, and do you have any ideas about how I could do this better? Or here's some things we learned from some interesting mistakes we made. That over time, we talk about real work that we're doing, and we interact, and we help each other become better. And the idea here isn't that your DBA team is going to run a community of practice. The idea here is that your subject matter expert team is going to initiate and sponsor a community practice that, if successful, is going to become a community on its own. In other words, it will eventually run itself. It will eventually be something that you're still part of, but that is bigger than your team and is a real community across all the members. It's great for your organization to have thriving communities of practices, because these are places where people are creative. People learn from one another. They build their expertise. They think more about pushing the boundaries of what your organization can do. And they also help in an interesting way. So Peter Hyde at Gartner, I went to a talk of his on community of practice. And one of the things he said about these that really stuck with me is that communities of practice foster intrinsic motivation. In other words, when we go to work, what makes us care about the work we do? Well, maybe getting paid does, right? Yeah, getting paid, extrinsic motivation, external things like money showing up in our bank account, they are motivating to a certain extent, right? It motivates us to get the job done. But what would really motivate us to do high quality work? Because, maybe that bonus, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't, right? And how related is it actually to the quality of my work? You may have different answers at different organizations, but there's something called intrinsic motivation, which is just that when you are part of a community around something and you share an interest in it with other people, you can start to develop different motivations for actually caring about that. I mean, part of it is you want to be part of this community who enjoys thinking about things. So, hey, me enjoying thinking about something, that's going to create better quality output. But then also being part of this group and being able to share my experiences with things of, oh, I tried that thing that you suggested and it did work well for me. Hey, that gives me positive feedback and a positive response, right? These interactions in the community, they encourage people to think more about stuff just by And I'm thinking about my own membership in communities is the fact that I'm a part of that community and I have these relationships with other people makes me want to be better at the things I do that are part of that community, right? So it helps foster intrinsic motivation in a way that just a paycheck doesn't do. So starting up one of these and helping it flourish can really be worthwhile. Now, how do you start it up? You have to really be persistent. With any community activity, consistency and persistence is the key because they don't all start up successfully right away, right? A lot of times when we're starting up something like this, it's like we're setting up a meeting, we're setting up this event, and not as many people came as we wanted, right? Not everybody is going to show up for every meeting the first time you have it, but you do need to keep inviting people. Your goal here is to build relationships around the organization, to improve communication between teams, and really to build the brand of your database team as the sponsors and the founders for this community of practice. So you've really got to keep at it. Peter Hyde, one of his recommendations that I thought was really good too was over time, you do want to, with this community, once you kind of get it going and you've got people showing up regularly, not only do you want to keep re-inviting people who haven't attended, just be really open. It's fine. Maybe they just haven't had time now. Maybe they actually haven't been interested at all now, right? Maybe this wasn't their thing. But the more you get some people showing up, other people are going to start hearing about this thing going on. They're going to start having FOMO. But you do want to shift around leadership periodically. And this has a couple different functions. It keeps the group from stagnating, in the sense of, oh, yeah, it's always done this way and this person, always runs it this way. You want to have the group be dynamic and be able to change. But also, you want the group to be able to be led by people from different parts of the organization. Ideally, if you have a community of practice around database work, ideally it's not the DBA team who's scheduling these meetings over and over again, right? Over time, maybe it's a year before you change leadership. That's fine. Maybe it's 18 months. But eventually, wouldn't it be a really cool community if there was somebody on the dev side who was like, yeah, I would actually like to be the organizer of this for a while and take that on and share that role back and forth between the teams. That's kind of the hallmark of a successful community is that it can survive changes in this, right? And, maybe sometimes you've got someone who takes on the role of leader who was able to participate for a while and they can no longer anymore. You got to change things up because they don't have time anymore. Hey, that happens, right? You always want to be seeking out ways that you can continue what you're doing, but still growing the group. This is also, if you have a community of practice, this is a great way for different people around the organization to share their successes with different processes and different innovations around the database with one another and be able to get information to take back to all their different groups in the organization too. So we talked about a few different things today, right? How do we collaborate with developers and DBAs in a DevOps world? And really this, I believe, very similar patterns happen for different subject matter experts, from architects to database administrators to other folks as well. Think about the relationship between the groups and check out that DevOps topologies site for different models that can work and see if you can identify, okay, this is the model that we think is going to work for us. Share that with the development team and say, hey, this is the way we think that working together could work. Does this look good to you? Right? How can we actually functionally work this out? When you're talking about that, when you identify the ways you're going to work together, you also want to think about how can you participate in that review process and shift that process left to as early in the development cycle as you can. Don't be the gatekeepers. Be the people whose expertise is brought in early on so that as changes are first merging into the pipeline, they are as good as possible. You also want insight into that pipeline so that you know when changes are moving through it as well. Think about the different ways, and as you learn about how the pipeline is working, you'll find different opportunities that can be automated, as well as having that happen through the relationships you're building. As this relationship changes, your DBA team will shift more to being a team of internal consultants rather than a team of gatekeepers. And thinking about how do we build this expertise in our team, as well as how do we build our brand and our relationship in the company, helps you make those changes in that team and really, really thrive in that way. I think this really is a growth opportunity for a lot of DBAs, moving from someone who carries out tasks to someone who really is a subject matter expert and who shares that expertise around the organization. A huge opportunity is initiating and sponsoring a community of practice around database development at your organization. And that can really, really be a cool community that can become bigger than your team, but still retain an important connection to your team over time. So thanks so much for this question. I thought this was a fantastic question. If you have a question, it can be about DevOps, it can be about something else, hit me up at sqlworkbooks.com/ask and let me know what your question is. I would love to cover it in a future webcast, maybe a blog post, maybe just an email. But yeah, let me know. So that URL, once again, is sqlworkbooks.com/ask. Thanks for joining me today for Dear SQL DBA. I'm Kendra Little from SQL Workbooks and from Redgate Software. Bye, folks. I'll talk to you again soon.